Welcome to this session on current federal efforts. I'm Elise Lipkowitz. I'm a current AAAS fellow and one of the co-organizers of the summit. And I'm pleased to be joined by three distinguished panelists who are engaged with White House initiatives related to climate change, adaptation, and resilience. In the bio book, there are much longer descriptions of each of their backgrounds and their career paths, and I encourage you to look more deeply at those. Our first speaker, Susan Ruffo, is the Associate Director for Climate Preparedness at the White House Council of Environmental Quality, where she leads the implementation of the climate preparedness pillar of the President's Climate Action Plan. Our second speaker is Dr. Laura Pettish. Laura, in her role as Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Adaptation and Ecosystems at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, leads OSTP's climate preparedness efforts. Our third speaker is the Honorable Alice Hill, Senior Advisor for Preparedness and Resilience at the National Security Council. In this role, Alice provides advice and counsel on implementing the President's Climate Action Plan, fosters coordination of preparedness activities, and helps develop policy to promote resilient infrastructure. Following a brief presentation by our speakers, we'll move to Q&A. When you entered the auditorium, you should have received an index card. If you don't have one, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will bring you one. As questions arise, kindly jot them down on your index card. Volunteers will be circulating in the aisles between presentations, as well as following Judge Hill's remarks to collect the note cards. The questions on the note cards are going to form the basis of the Q&A, so please participate. Susan?
Great. I guess I assume this is just on, right? So thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. It's great to see, I saw a list of the participants. It's great to see the mix of people that are here working on this issue. It's always, I think, interesting to see who's coming to these types of events and who's talking about resilience and to watch it change over time, which has been really exciting. So thanks to you all and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. As Elise mentioned, we're talking primarily about what the federal government is doing on the climate preparedness and resilience side. But I think as you'll see as we start talking that it's really impossible to separate what the federal government is doing from what anyone else is doing, since preparedness really cuts across all levels of government as well as the private and public sectors and the civil society. So I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity that we have here. There's no one sector that can solve this problem. There's no one level of government that can solve the problem. But there's also maybe no one actor that can actually hold it up and that is, the only key to the puzzle. Better? So, I think getting back to the federal government has some very important roles to play in this area in building preparedness and resilience. And I think the fact that you've got sort of three of us here from the White House from three different components shows you both the breadth of the issue, but also the importance that we've been placing on it. And I think it's great that we have Laura here, who's working on really the science and technology aspects that form a foundation of a lot of what we need to do here, as well as Judge Hill, who is representing the national security community, which is, you think about all of our agencies that work on not only the obvious issues like our defense and homeland security agencies, but also all the agencies that work on critical infrastructure and issues like health. All of those fall under that bucket. So the fact that all of these agencies are paying more and more attention to this issue, and the fact that the National Security Council is actually putting a lot of resources into it, I think is really important. And I think, from the government point of view, the federal government point of view, I think we've got a couple of different responsibilities here. One is that we need to make sure that our own sort of house and operations are in order. And if you think about the 30% of the land in the contiguous United States that the federal government owns and manages, then it becomes very apparent why that's important. But you also think about the investments we have in NASA facilities, for example, or the 300,000 buildings that DOD has across the country. You start to realize that we have a massive financial investment of personnel and workforce that we have to be paying attention and taking care of. And then you think about all of the programs that the federal government runs, things like highway funds that go to states or funds that go out to support water utilities. We also have another level of, I think, responsibility there to make sure that we're making those types of investments in the smartest way possible. But we recognize that a lot of the actual decisions that need to be made for resilience are not going to be made by the federal government. There are issues like zoning, like building codes, like land use, like infrastructure investment. Those are not things that we do, or at least do everywhere for everyone. We do it a lot for ourselves, but local governments, tribal governments, state governments, private sector entities all have responsibility for those too. So from the federal government side, I think we think about this as how do we support those decisions and make sure that those entities have the information they need, and the sort of the policy frameworks they need to make sure that those decisions can help them be as resilient as possible. And I think you'll hear from both Alice and Laura a little bit about what we're doing to try to support that on the policy and science sides. And if you look across the US, you can see leaders in this field already. You can see them at the local government level, places like Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Houston. You can see them at the state level, California, Vermont, Maryland. States are not waiting and cities are not waiting for the federal government, but we want to be partners in this. And we take those roles very seriously. So I think, you probably all know the president released last June the Climate Action Plan. And there were 3 pillars to that plan. One was cutting carbon pollution that causes climate change. The second is preparing the nation for the impacts that we're already feeling and that are inevitable. And the third is leading at the international level. So, we know that all 3 of those pillars are critically important. The one we're talking about today is obviously the resilience and preparedness pillar, but that fits into the larger plan. And what we've done with that plan, the plan itself was really to announce to sort of the world and the general public, this is what the president intends to do, these are our commitments, and this is what we think is really important. After the plan in last November came out an executive order on preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. That executive order is much drier reading. But it really is aimed at a very specific audience. The audience is really federal agencies. And it's really that first set of instructions to federal agencies saying, this is how we want you to implement this plan. And here's the things that we want you to focus on. It's still very high level because each agency obviously has very different missions, very different capacities, very different resources. So the idea was, here's a set of instructions for our agencies. Now they get to go out and sort of figure out how best to implement those instructions at their own levels. And you'll see that playing out in all different agencies. One of the things, I guess taking a step back, I think the story starts well before even the action plan last year. Since the beginning of the administration, we've really been focused on how we build preparedness across the country. And that has started with another executive order on sustainability, as well as an interagency task force that was led by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And through those mechanisms is where we really started to bring agencies together and look across the federal government for what we could be doing on preparedness. The Climate Action Plan really took it to the next level, and it really made that link to, not being just about federal preparedness, but really national preparedness. And how do we reach out to all of these other partners that need to be a part of this? So last year, federal agencies released their first ever adaptation plans, and each agency was asked to basically look at its own vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change and figure out, what it was that they needed to do to prepare themselves. And so there was, I think, a really interesting mix of agencies, some who had been looking at this for a very long time, particularly some of the natural resource agencies who have climate scientists on staff, who had been thinking about climate change for a long time, who really kind of understood a lot of what was happening in their own lands, as well as the things they needed to do. Some agencies that really had never thought of it before, because they don't have climate scientists on staff. Climate change itself was not necessarily core to their missions. It wasn't something they were charged with thinking about sort of on average. But when they actually started to think about it in terms of how it impacted what their core missions were, we got a lot of very interesting responses. So agencies like the US Postal Service, which is not known for climate science and shouldn't be, but really when you think about it, is an incredibly exposed agency. They have an enormous amount of their personnel who spend a lot of time outside in all different parts of the country and all different types of conditions. They have to transport things all over the country under all different kinds of conditions, all different types of transportation modes. So they're extremely vulnerable to all different kinds of impacts of climate change. And they really sat down and did a really great job of thinking about what that meant for them and who they were relying on. They're relying on state transportation systems, and they're relying on airports, and they're relying on a whole bunch of things that are outside of their control, but that they could do their best to sort of build resilience into how they think about, they work with them. So there's really a lot that's underway. It's really exciting. We are working to really bring those partnerships back together. Part of the Climate Action Plan and the executive order set up a new, not so new now, I guess 6-month-old task force for governors, mayors, county executives, and tribal leaders to really work with the federal government on that interface of what they need to do and what they want to do and what the federal government can and should do to support them. And so we're expecting a set of recommendations from them in the fall that will tell us what is it that the federal government needs to do, sort of on one end to really make sure that our policies are allowing them to make the kinds of choices they want to make on resilience that they need to make. And if you think about it, a lot of the mission-driven programs and policies that agencies have in place were put there for a very specific mission, to do a very specific thing, to build our state transportation systems. They were assuming that the climate at least was going to be stable in all of that. So, they didn't really think about climate change in there. They're thinking about how do we get this mission done? How do we make sure we build an efficient, safe transportation system? Now we have this added piece that we're more and more aware of that you can't build a transportation system and not think about climate change. Those are long-lived investments. They're there for decades at least. So, what does that mean then for the investments you're making? How do you need to design those investments? What are the kinds of things you need to do as you maintain them and operate them to really make sure that you're taking climate change into account? So I think our partners at the state, local, and tribal levels are helping us to really figure out where in those programs there are ways that we can better support the kinds of resilience that needs to be happening on the ground. And as I said, that'll be coming out this fall. I think the other piece and the other partners that are really important in this are the private sector and civil society. And you'll see several places in the Climate Action Plan where we're reaching out explicitly to the private sector, particularly the insurance sector, the health sector, and really thinking about, what is it that we can do with them as key components of our economy in these sectors to really make a difference on resilience. And the other piece of that is if you think about critical infrastructure, and I'm sure Alice will talk about this too, a lot of our critical infrastructure, some say up to as much as 85%, is owned and managed by the private sector. So obviously we need to be working with them to make sure that the pieces of that critical infrastructure are resilient and in place when we need them. So I guess I will leave it at that, but just to say it's clear, I think, that the federal government, we think of ourselves as having an important role, and I think we take that role very seriously and want to be very responsible, but we also know we need to reach out and work with others, and I think that's a key component of working on the resilience puzzle. So thank you very much.
So thanks, Susan. That was a really helpful overview. And what I'm going to talk about now is what are some of the efforts underway to better deploy science that the federal government produces to inform and support climate resilience efforts. So I mentioned some of this a little bit earlier this morning, but one of the key challenges is how do we provide not just the best science that we have, but also the science that's useful to people. And that's, we basically are finding, as Admiral Titley mentioned, that more information doesn't always lead to better decision making. Usable information can, and sometimes does, not always. And one of the things that we all need to recognize, especially those of us who are scientists, is it's not just about the science. So, they might have the best science that's useful, that's at the scales that are relevant, but there are also other issues like public values or, economic feasibility that need to be taken into account to support decision making. But what we can do and are trying to do is better partner across scales to provide actionable information for decision makers. And one thing that we've definitely learned over recent years is that science is often most useful when it's produced in partnership with the people who will be making the actual decisions. So it's not particularly useful to develop a model of climate impacts on water and kind of throw it over the transom and expect water utility managers to use it, particularly because sometimes it's not actually what they need or want. But what is useful is to, before we even start the science, talk to the water utility managers that we're trying to support and see what they need and have a dialogue with them and a back and forth. So basically, we call this co-production of knowledge. So work with them in a place, ideally have local trusted experts. So again, not particularly useful to fly in someone from DC to do a one-off with a particular group and disappear the next day, but to have people working in places and having sustained relationships where information can exchange in a multi-directional way. So, based on that understanding, the Climate Action Plan and the associated executive order called for the federal government to develop and provide authoritative, easily accessible, usable, and timely data, information, and tools on climate preparedness and resilience. So all of those words are there for a reason, and we're trying. We still have a lot of work to do. One of the early outcomes in March was that the administration launched a new climate data initiative, and the purpose of this was to make data on climate more available. This wasn't necessarily targeted specifically to decision makers, but rather kind of to the innovation community so that they can develop tools or apps or whatever it is for decision makers to use. So it's a prototype right now. The initial set of data were focused on coastal flooding and sea level rise, given that we know that that's a major vulnerability. And there will be another set of data coming out on food, and that will be hopefully in late July. Another product which is currently under development and tentatively scheduled for release for later this summer is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. This is intended to be actually useful directly in support of decision makers. And the toolkit is intended to serve as a web-based resource for providing authoritative, timely information and tools. Largely, the initial stages will be focused on better deploying existing tools that the government has to support climate resilience. I think decision makers often get frustrated that it's hard for them to find tools that the government produces, and they don't want to know whether they need to go to the EPA or NOAA or DOI or whatever for information. So we're trying to make the information more accessible through clear entry points. And these efforts, co-led by NOAA and NASA with support from the White House, have had tremendous engagement from dozens of federal agencies that are both kind of on the supply and demand and the decision-making and the information users continuum. So that's been a really productive dialogue, and we'll see a lot of other topics come out over the coming months once these things are sort of out there in prototype phase and can be tested and iterated on. But a major accomplishment that I want to highlight, which has been mentioned several times this morning, is the third National Climate Assessment. So in May, the administration released the assessment. It had a team of more than 300 experts, a federal advisory committee of 60 people, might be like the biggest federal advisory committee ever, I don't know, but, and that wasn't just academic scientists, it was actual private sector partners, tribal officials, all kinds of really key players in the climate preparedness space were engaged in that advisory committee. The report was extensively reviewed by experts, including agencies in the National Academy of Sciences. There were literally thousands and thousands of public comments on the document, multiple listening sessions across the country, and the whole purpose of the assessment from the outset was to be useful. So not just to do a rigorous analysis of our comprehensive understanding of the impacts of climate change on the US, but to actually serve as a platform from which to support decision making. So for that reason, it covers all US regions. So there's regional scale information. It also covers key economic sectors like energy, agriculture, human health. And the main message of the assessment is that climate change is not a distant threat. It's happening now, and it's affecting us. It's not just the polar bears, it's our own backyards. And so this report, it's if you were to print it, we have one printed copy that we sent to the Hill, was 829 pages. But what we did was make it all very web accessible so that you can actually play with the assessment and explore what you're most interested in. And it's a really, really awesome user interface. If you haven't gone yet, go to nca2014.globalchange.gov. We also have a 20-page overview and a 100-page highlights document. When it was released, we saw tremendous hunger for that information. There were 4,800 news articles about the National Climate Assessment. There were over 2.5 terabytes worth of PDF downloads in the first week alone. And it was covered on Jimmy Fallon, John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, so it even made it into the humor news, which is when you know you made it big. And it was the front page of every major newspaper. So that was, we were really happy to see that because people were paying attention and they were very interested in it. And it's kind of kicked off a series of interesting conversations at the local level too. And so we're hoping that over the coming months and years, the assessment serves as a resource to support climate preparedness efforts across the country.
Good morning. I want to thank Elise for inviting me to this extraordinary event, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with two women with whom I work very closely. I can tell you it's a team effort, and that perhaps reflects some of the governance challenges. We really have to work in a collaborative manner in this area because it touches everyone. I also want to just commend to you, as Laura did, the National Climate Assessment. I had the opportunity to serve ex officio on the FACA. I think it's an extraordinary accomplishment, and for those of you who are interested, I know some of you are fellows in this area, I think it's a wonderful way to introduce yourself to how science will have to come to a format that is easily consumed by all the people who are going to be working in this area. And it's also a wonderful introduction for you to send anyone to who's interested in learning more about climate change. We are going to have to get people to care, and that assessment is one very tangible way to get people to start thinking and acting on what's happening to our environment. I want to also applaud the organizers of the conference for looking at the governance issues in this area. I think you've already heard from Susan how this is very much a local issue in its impacts. Communities across the globe, including in the United States, are going to have to plan for the impacts to climate change. And that poses a governance challenge when the impacts don't honor jurisdictional boundaries. They cut across county lines, state lines, and international boundaries. So how do we come to agreement on what the proper steps are? One important way, and that is something that's happening with the President's Climate Action Plan, as Susan mentioned, is a focus on the locals, to empower them to make the very important choices for what they will be doing in their own communities to ensure resiliency to climate change. And obviously the federal government can encourage communities to take various steps, either through carrots or sticks, to help their preparedness efforts. That is also a focus of the Climate Action Plan, to remove barriers that keep communities from building back resiliently or building resiliently in the first place, but also to give them the incentives to do so when they're making a choice on that transportation system that Susan mentioned, and there'll be federal dollars involved. Make sure that it's climate resilient, at least to the best available science that the federal government is working very hard to provide. My work in particular focuses on the intersection of climate change and national security. I work on the National Security Council staff, and let me make clear that this is viewed as an issue of national security. Admiral Titley was a leader in this area with the Navy Climate Change Task Force. They were really the first clear statement about what this would mean for the Navy, for the national security, and others have followed his lead and the lead of the Navy in developing plans in the national security sphere to address what challenges are ahead for us in the national security space. In 2010, our national security strategy recognized that the danger from climate change is real, urgent, and severe. If you heard President Obama's speech at West Point last week during the commencement, he noted that for the graduates in uniform from West Point, their careers will be shaped by, quote, the creeping national security crisis, end quote, caused by climate change. And I think you will well appreciate that national security extends beyond armed attacks by other states against the United States, and indeed beyond threats from people who purposely seek to destroy or damage our country. But of national security concern are things like pandemics. Very serious if we have a pandemic that threatens a wide percentage of our population. Disasters, humanitarian disasters or otherwise. Climate change, none of these have human intentionality, but they can threaten our national security. And as Secretary Kerry has recently noted, climate change can produce effects similar to those of weapons of mass destruction. We know that climate change will affect virtually every country on Earth. It is, after all, global climate warming. Other nations around the world are also viewing this as a national security risk. As to your governance piece, that is part of the governance piece. The American Security Project surveyed every country in the world and asked if climate change was included in their national security strategies, and 70% of nations said that it was. We know, for example, that climate change will affect water security, food security, energy systems, and, as Susan has mentioned, the stability of our critical infrastructure. It could, for example, affect our military mission if our key military bases were severely damaged by extreme weather, or if they're just threatened by sea level rise so that we have to be thinking, where are we going to move them? In 2014, the Department of Defense's Quadrennial Defense Review observed also that pressures caused by climate change will influence resource competition across the globe, while placing additional burdens on economies, societies, and governance institutions around the world. This is a challenge unlike, I think, any we've really seen before, and so that's why your focus on governance is particularly important, because those choices haven't been fully made yet. One thing that we can predict are some of the consequences, but one thing we know for sure, that we're going to have consequences that will appear as surprises in the form of unanticipated events. And certainly our national security apparatus is skilled in looking at those uncertain events, but we know they're coming. So that means that we as decision makers, as the National Research Council has observed, must expect to be surprised, and as we're learning, probably with increasing frequency, as we're having to predict what will occur. So given that this is a national security risk, given that there's a great deal of uncertainty, including the level of emissions, and obviously the level of emissions will affect the national security risk. The warmer we get, the greater the impacts, the greater the risks, and we do not know what our level of emissions will be. So clearly we cannot fully understand all the national security risks. We've identified many to date, and we are having a growing understanding that this is a very significant homeland security risk. How do we make sure that our critical infrastructure in the United States, not only that of the Department of Defense, but of our power sector, our energy sector, how does it continue to operate after an event like Sandy? We saw that it was heavily damaged. We saw that there are cascading events. Third, secondary and tertiary effects. Many of those effects are not fully understood yet. So as we look forward as to what kind of governance structure we will need and continue to build on what we have, we need to make sure that this governance structure will allow us to continue our federal missions in a manner that leaves the nation secure. It means that we must be able to respond to multiple events at the same time, perhaps of an extreme nature. We must be able to support state and locals in their efforts to ensure resiliency at home. We must supply the best data available, as Laura has mentioned. We must build resiliency across all the sectors: transportation, energy, health. We must work on a multinational and binational basis so that countries are not destabilized by the effects of climate change. And as I mentioned, we must address the cascading effects of climate change. So I will leave it with that, other than I would want to share with you something that has begun to guide me as I work in this area. It's something that John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, with whom Laura works closely, has stated in this area. I don't know if he stated it originally, but I've heard him state it. And that is, we must find ways to avoid the unmanageable of climate change, and we must find ways to manage the unavoidable. To do that, we're going to have governance systems that work, and that's the challenge. My very final statement to you is time is of the essence. I don't think we can think that this is something far off. If you read that National Climate Assessment or the IPCC report, you'll know it's here. And most of this audience look like they're starting out in their careers. I urge you to get engaged. There is no more existential threat to the way of life that we've enjoyed. You've enjoyed up to your age now, and we have to make some decisions here to put us on a different course. So thank you.
We're now going to start the Q&A. If you have not put a question yet on your note card or passed it down to the end of the aisle, I'd appreciate your doing so now. We have two folks circulating to pick them up. But I'm going to get started by picking up on Judge Hill's final comment about time being of the essence. And the recently released National Climate Assessment notes that, quote, substantial adaptation planning is occurring in the private and public sectors at all levels of government. However, few measures have been implemented, and those that have appear to be incremental changes. What can be done to encourage the implementation of more adaptation measures and to overcome the barriers inhibiting more substantial changes?
All right, I'll start. I think part of that is a function of where we have been. If you look even in just the last several years, I think people's attitudes and awareness of adaptation or preparedness have really changed a lot. You know, we started off thinking that adaptation was surrender, and that, you know, by talking about adaptation, we were somehow giving up on the idea that we were going to do something about mitigation and lowering our emissions. And I think it took a little while for people to really embrace the fact that actually they're both necessary. We can't have one without the other. You know, I'm a little worried that there was a piece just recently, and I think the Wall Street Journal is starting to really emphasize, well, we can adapt out of it. No, that's not actually right either. So we can't go that far, but they're both necessary. So I think part of that is, you know, we started a little bit later in a lot of places than maybe would have been practical. I think also, you know, the science is showing us more and more that things are happening more quickly than we had anticipated. So, you know, part of that is the function of, you know, we're starting with planning. We have to understand our vulnerabilities. We have to understand what we're planning for, and then start to implement those plans. But part of it too is, and I think this goes back to what Alice also mentioned, is, you know, we have the ability through federal policies, through federal programs, through state policies and programs, through local governments, to provide incentives for people to really think about this. And just by asking the question as you're designing a transportation project or a coastal flooding project or a water utility or a national park or some sort of you know, preserve for natural resources or a forest, just thinking about, as I'm managing this or building this or designing this, you know, what is it going to look like here 20 years from now, 50 years from now? And how do I build that in? And I think we've historically been used to using data that looks backwards. So we use maybe FEMA floodplain maps, or we use other historical data that tells us about what extreme events have looked like or what flood events look like. That's fine, and I think that was a very reasonable thing to do for us for a while, but now that's not good enough because we know it's changing. So really thinking about how do we get that forward-looking data into those decisions that we're making. They're still fundamentally some of the same decisions. We're still dealing with heat, with flooding, with rain, with high tides. We're just dealing with them at a different level. So if you know you have to build something for hotter weather or more water or less water, we can do that. We know how to build we know how to build a lot of these things. We know how to design a lot of these things. We just need to start taking those things into account.
I would agree with everything that Susan has said. I think that we have been judged as behind by both the IPCC and tacitly by the National Climate Assessment in our adaptation efforts. So what do we need to do? We need to have more engagement. We need to get people to care. And part of that is having them understand their vulnerabilities. So the President has been driving this home to the federal agencies. He required each federal agency to do a plan for adaptation. Their second round of plans are due June 30th. We had an exercise or workshop for all federal agencies based on the National Climate Assessment so that those agency planners would better understand the risks to their agencies. We're hoping to do similar things with state and local so that they can understand what sea level rise will look like at a certain point as they're making that decision where they're going to locate their wastewater treatment plant or what they're going to do with their existing wastewater treatment plant when it's underwater. One of the things that's particularly hard in this area is that sometimes we think we'll just plan on our own and we'll solve it ourselves. But there's a particular image that resonates with me that I'll share with you that shows, I think, the fallacy of that. During Sandy, of course, there are lots of reports, storms coming in, so everybody's trying to make themselves flood-proof. Down on Wall Street, they expected flooding, so some of our major banking institutions put really high walls of sandbags around their headquarters, some better than others. So if you go online, there are funny pictures where there's, like one sandbag, which was not going to hold back the waters, and then very, very tall sandbags. One of our most prominent banks did a very good job of protecting their bank. So you see the picture, beautiful sandbags around it, and then you see after Sandy occurred, a picture of the building taken at night, and the entire building is lit up, beautiful. But there's a car floating in front of the building. So the water did not get inside the building, but neither did any people. So you can have that building lit up, ready for business, but none of your workers, customers, clients can get there. And that is instructive that we are going to have to work as whole of community across jurisdictional boundaries to make sure our transportation, our energy systems allow business to continue. So when we talk about resiliency, a lot of our focus is how do we manage to continue operations in the face of very extreme events. And sometimes multiple events occurring. So we are all learning as we go, but it's going to take involvement from many people, including those of you in this audience. This is the issue of our time. So I encourage you to get involved and help find solutions to help prepare us so that we can continue to enjoy what we've had here in the United States and across the globe.
I have a couple of questions here that relate to infrastructure, and I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the administration's approach to enhancing the nation's infrastructure, whether it is proactively or in response to disaster recovery, and maybe share some examples. We all know that the federal government makes significant investments in helping localities fund light rail systems and metros and airports and highways and other things. And of course, there's a lot of concern about our electric grid. So if you could talk, maybe give an example or two of some of the things you've been working on.
I can just mention that one of the things the Climate Action Plan called for is a sector-by-sector analysis of the threats to those sectors, including the infrastructure. The Energy Department last July issued a report examining the threat to energy infrastructure from climate change, and there are multiple threats. And we've actually already seen them in play. So, for example, transmission towers, often in the West, they are threatened by wildfire. They don't conduct as well if in warmer weather. Transmission lines sag, but there's a higher demand for energy. With higher demand for energy, sometimes there are greater water needs depending on the nature of the power plant. Sometimes there's cooling requirements, but the rivers are either too low or too warm. So Department of Energy is working on a quadrennial energy review that will do a deep dive on those threats. We also have the DHS, it's MPPD, works on infrastructure protection. They are also doing analysis. We'll have an analysis from the healthcare sector, from transportation and others, trying to understand these secondary and tertiary effects. So it's a complex, hard topic because we don't own all the infrastructure. It's in private hands. So we can encourage resilience, and we need to work on ways to incentivize that to the best we can, but it's not entirely it's in terms of governance, it's not entirely within the federal control.
I was wondering if you would speak a bit about how our federal efforts in the adaptation space relate to international efforts in the adaptation space. I mean, there's a lot of talk about mitigation and important work, being approached on that at the international level. But what about adaptation?
So I can start. I mean, I think there are a few things. The U.S. is very engaged in the international discussion on adaptation through the State Department and other agencies. So that is a big piece. And our international agencies like USAID and State Department are very involved both in the substance as well as some of the financial support for that work. So I think that's a really important piece. I think also in terms of thinking about, how we look at our bigger picture of, what we can contribute. I think a lot of what we're doing and learning domestically, we can also be sharing. So, how we're tackling this, for example, I think, to get back to the infrastructure question, thinking about, in the Sandy recovery, how do we use that recovery money not only to, help people recover and be safer, but really look ahead to the future so that we're not just replacing the same vulnerabilities that were there, but actually thinking about, okay, what do we actually need to be more resilient in the future? And so some of those lessons learned we're sharing internationally. We're also learning lessons from other countries, and I think that's really important. There are developing countries that are doing national adaptation plans. What does that look like? There are other developed countries, the UK and France, that are trying to tackle some of these same issues. So I think, we have obviously a different system than some of these countries, so not everything applies, but it's interesting to see how they tackle some of these questions and how we tackle them. So it's definitely an ongoing discussion and something that we've been engaged at, both from our international agencies as well as our domestic agencies.
One of the themes that comes up with governance and the kind of layered system that we have here in the United States is that a lot of the activities will be happening at the local level, but I'm also curious about what, if any, role there is for the federal government in ensuring that one municipality's approach or one state's approach to addressing adaptation is not maladaptive to another municipality or state, and when might is there a role at some point for the federal government to sort of step in to referee?
I think that might require some significant legislative changes.
I mean, I think I'm gonna take the more positive spin on this. I think there's always I think it depends, right? With the federal government doesn't want to come in and mess in the business of municipalities when it's not its role or responsibility. But I think what we do have a responsibility to do is help to convene conversations and dialogues and information sharing when there are opportunities for collaboration. And so, for example, on drought, the government has what's called the National Integrated Drought Information System. And that was partly started because we realized that drought does not know jurisdictional boundaries, and a lot of drought issues are at the watershed scale. Well, watersheds cross many state boundaries, many municipalities, and so what NIDIS, this effort, has been doing, and also now the National Drought Resilience Partnership, which is a new effort under the Climate Action Plan, is helping to bring together information across scales and also to convene conversations within the regions with people who might not be so used to talking to each other or might not want to talk to each other, again, to kind of just be there to facilitate dialogue and regional scale planning. So that's something where the federal government has an important role to play.
I'll just add, I'm a former judge, so I think some of this, if there's truly, just as if your neighbor did something that negatively affected you, there may be some litigation about it, and we will start learning more about the torts and other areas that will be called into play in the court system. So even though this is a novel problem, I think we're still going to rely on some of our governance structures that already exist, like the courts, to sort out the very difficult liability issues. I don't think we'll be asking the federal government to, after the fact, broker who's liable, except through our federal courts.
Well, thank you all for a wonderful discussion, and we're going to transition now to our next panel.
Thank you.